They came with a census. That was the first thing Sergeant Alara Voss noticed when the Quorum ships descended over the outer settlements. Not the weapons arrays folded along their bellies like sleeping claws. Not the harmonic shriek their atmospheric entry burned into the sky. Just the census drones, small as fists, pouring out of every ventral hatch by the tens of thousands, and dispersing through the dust and smoke with their blue scan lights already sweeping. Patient, methodical, counting, the Quorum didn't conquer through fire, they conquered through math. Their doctrine, broadcast on every human frequency, before a single weapon discharged, was simple enough to understand and too large to fight. Population equilibrium, they called it. The settled human worlds had exceeded sustainable projection thresholds by a factor of 2.7. The Quorum's computational consensus determined, with what they described as regret, that a managed reduction was required. One registered human identity per habitat unit. All others would be transferred to stewardship. A word they chose carefully, a word that meant nothing terrible if you said it quickly, and didn't ask where the transports went. Nobody asked where the transports went. At first, Alara Voss asked where the transports went on a Tuesday in late November, 3 years into the occupation. In the same breath that she asked herself why the Quorum registration database showed only one living person named Alara Voss when she knew, with bone-deep certainty, that there were 7 of them. She was the second-born. Her grandfather, a stubborn man who had served in 3 colonial militia actions and trusted governments about as far as he could throw a drop shuttle, had named them after the days of the week and raised them in a below-grade HAB unit in Sector 12. He'd begun the system when they were 6 years old, sitting them around the kitchen table with the kind of patience that looks like anger. One of you goes out, one face to the world, one name in the registry, and every night you come home and you tell the others everything. Everything. You memorize each other, you become each other. If one of you slips, all of you fall. They practiced until it was reflex. Monday handled the registration. Naturally, by birth order, by the logic of a firstborn who understood that the identity had to live somewhere full-time. She was the one who filed their single-unit census declaration, who smiled at the Quorum compliance officers when they swept the block, who wore their shared names like a second skin that fit her best, because she'd never had to take it off. Alara Voss, registered resident of Habitat 12C, employed as a resource analyst for the Bureau of Human Interests, the collaboration office the Quorum had established, so humanity could participate, with dignity, in its own administration. The rest of them rotated. One day at a time, one sister at a time, Alara Voss walked the sector, took the tube, bought food, submitted reports, spoke to neighbors. The others waited inside. Each night, the one who'd been out that day stood in the kitchen under the single working light and recited everything. The checkpoint scanner frequency, the new patrol pattern on Meridian Row, the name of the compliance officer who checked IDs with 2 fingers and a slow exhale, the small alteration in tone that meant suspicion versus routine. The others listened and updated their internal maps. By morning, they each knew the world a little better, even the ones who hadn't touched it. Their grandfather had taught them that information is the only weapon that multiplies when you share it. He was gone by the time Monday disappeared. Wednesday noticed first. They'd had a brief crossover window. 2 minutes, no more. By the HAB unit's back service door, where Wednesday handed off the wrist registry token, and Monday should have been there to receive it. She wasn't. Wednesday stood in the cold with the token in her palm until the 2 minutes became 10, and the 10 became the kind of silence that means a door closed somewhere it can't be reopened. She came back inside and looked at the others and said, "Something happened to Monday." They went through the protocols the way their grandfather had drilled them. Cold and precise. The grief pushed to a shelf they'd deal with later. They pulled Monday's last transmission, the nightly debrief she'd left recorded, in case she couldn't deliver it in person. Her voice was steady, which was worse than if it hadn't been. She said she'd been approached by a Quorum compliance liaison named Seth Orr, who worked the resource analyst floor. She said Seth Orr had spoken to her, only to her, specifically to her, using a cadence that suggested he understood that she was singular and that her singularity was complicated. She said she needed more time to assess. She said she would explain when she got home. She never got home. It was Thursday who decided they had to go in. Thursday was the 4th born and built like their grandfather. Not large, but dense, as if her bones were slightly heavier than they should be, as if she'd been assembled by someone who expected her to be hit and wanted her to still be standing afterward. She had a scar along her left jawline from a childhood fall that none of the others had, which had required a period of creative cosmetics and strategic angling toward registry cameras, and she had a quality that the others called stubbornness, and she called accuracy. Once she had determined that a thing needed doing, she did not revise that determination. She laid it out on the kitchen table like a tactical map. Monday had been inside the Bureau of Human Interests for 9 days. The Bureau occupied the old prefectural building in Central Sector 12. 7 floors of it. The lower 3 now refitted as Quorum compliance processing, and the upper 4 as the joint administrative offices where humans sat across from Quorum coordinators and filed the forms that gave the occupation its appearance of cooperation. There were 2 loading docks on the building's south face. Compliance-cleared personnel were transported in sealed vehicles with magnetic registration strips. If you had a strip, a vehicle, and a body that read as non-living on thermal scan, you could move through the secondary dock checkpoint without identity verification. Saturday, who was a mechanic by both nature and necessity, said she could pull a strip from a decommissioned transport in the district impound lot. Sunday, who had spent her rotation days near the medical hub and absorbed a considerable working vocabulary of Quorum biological protocols, said that a sedative compound in a concentration of 0.4% would bring a human's thermal signature down to cold within 3 minutes and keep it there for approximately 40. Thursday said, "That's plenty of time." They argued about who would go. They argued the way their grandfather had taught them to argue, not from emotions, but from function. Thursday was the natural candidate, because Thursday was the one who had decided it needed doing, and also because Thursday was the one who had, 3 years ago, gotten into a close-quarters altercation with a Quorum compliance unit and walked away from it, having learned that the joints behind their secondary limbs were less well-armored than the joints in front. That was the kind of knowledge that had a use. Wednesday would drive. Friday would run comms from the maintenance sublevel across the street. Saturday would have the transport running in the alley behind the Bureau's East Service exit by the time Thursday needed it. They gave themselves 1 night to prepare and spent most of it memorizing the Bureau's internal layout from the schematic they'd kept updated through 18 months of their rotation day observations. Alara Voss, resource analyst, had walked those corridors. She had noted the positions of the scan arrays and the patrol intervals and the specific elevator that required a secondary authorization code versus the one that didn't. All of that was in the shared memory. All of it was available to Thursday when she lay down on the transport pallet with the sedative administered and her thermal signature cooling towards 0. She spent the 2 minutes of consciousness she had left thinking about Monday's voice in that recording. Steady, calculating, carrying something it hadn't named. She thought she recognized what it was. She'd heard it in her own voice sometimes, in the moments when a problem got large enough that the only solution stopped looking like a solution and started looking like a sacrifice. She didn't let herself finish the thought. She let the cold come, and she was still. She woke up to the smell of recycled air and the low harmonic frequency that the Quorum used in their enclosed spaces, a vibration that sat just below the threshold of hearing and made humans feel, without knowing why, that they were small. Thursday lay still for 2 full seconds and listened to her body come back online and thought, smaller than you think. Saturday had gotten her as far as sublevel 2 before the strip expired. Thursday moved through the maintenance corridors the way their grandfather had taught them to move through any space with surveillance. Not quickly, not slowly, with the specific quality of presence that says, I belong here. I have always been here. There is nothing to look at. She pulled herself up through a service hatch on the 3rd floor and came out behind an intake processing corridor that smelled of ozone and something organic she couldn't name. She found Tuesday in a holding alcove near the east stairwell, sitting with her back against the wall, and one eye closed in a way that, after a moment, Thursday understood wasn't voluntary. They looked at each other, and Thursday saw in Tuesday's remaining eye a flat, pragmatic fury that she recognized the way you recognize a face in a mirror. Tuesday said nothing. Thursday crouched beside her, put her hand briefly on Tuesday's knee, and then they moved. They found Monday in a coordination suite on the 4th floor, seated across a desk from Seth Yer, who was a Quorum coordinator of middle rank, identifiable by the arrangement of bioluminescent nodes along his dorsal ridge, which shifted color when he processed data, which he was doing continuously, which meant he was thinking hard about something. Monday looked up when Thursday came through the door and went very still, in the way that meant she was running calculations, and Thursday looked at her sister's face and read what was in it, and felt something go quiet and cold in her chest. Monday said her name. Just that. The way you say a name when you owe it an explanation. Seth swiveled his sensory cluster toward Thursday with an attention that felt, as Quorum attention always did, like being itemized. He said, in the flat synthesized human speech his translation implant produced, "You are not the registered individual." "No," Thursday said. He processed that for a moment. His dorsal nodes cycled through amber. Then he said, "How many?" Thursday looked at Monday, and Monday looked at the desk, and Thursday said, "Enough." What came out then? In the coordination suite with the harmonic hum vibrating in the walls, and Tuesday bleeding quietly into her sleeve, in the corridor outside, came out in pieces. The way truth does when it has been carried too long and set down in the wrong place. Monday had not intended to betray them. She had intended to negotiate. She had understood something that the rest of them hadn't or hadn't wanted to. The Quorum census doctrine had a clause, buried in the compliance protocols, that allowed for a registered identity to absorb a dependent population unit if that unit could demonstrate resource-neutral integration. She had found the clause. She had spent 3 months verifying it. She had brought it to Sether as a proposal, and Sether had taken it upward and upward through the Quorum administrative chain, and it had come back as a contingency review, requiring physical verification of all dependent units, which was a bureaucratic formulation for, bring them in. She had not told the others because she knew they would refuse. She had not told them she was pregnant because she knew it would change the calculation. She had been trying, with the particular exhausted ingenuity of a firstborn who had spent her entire life carrying the weight of being the face of 7 people, to solve the problem that their grandfather had deferred by finding a door instead of a hiding place. She had found the wrong door. Thursday stood in the middle of the room and felt the shape of the situation the way you feel the shape of a space in the dark, by the things you bump into. The situation had one exit. The exit was either the Quorum granting Monday's petition, which required her sister's voluntary presentation for census verification, which required trust that the Quorum would honor a clause in their own protocols, a species that had arrived with a census and taken 3 years to reveal that stewardship meant incineration, or the situation had a different exit. She looked at Sether, she said, "You've been keeping records, the intake logs, the transport manifests, the stewardship processing data." He said, "Yes." She said, "Where?" He told her. It took her a moment to understand why he'd answered, and when she understood, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief. Just a small sorrow for the thing that the Quorum had gotten so badly wrong. They had built their entire occupation on the mathematics of population. They had counted and tabulated and calculated. They had never once considered that a species that had survived 700 years of its own wars, famines, plagues, and interior collapses might have developed, somewhere in its complicated genome, an absolute and irrational refusal to be managed. Sether had answered because he was trying to model her. He was trying to understand the anomaly of 7 identical humans operating as one, and in his attempt to understand it, he had given her the only piece of data she needed. Friday was on comms. Friday, who spent her rotation days near the communications infrastructure that the Quorum had patched into the human net, who had spent 18 months building a map of every node and relay and broadcast point in Sector 12, who had asked Thursday 3 months ago, with the quiet precision of someone who had been thinking about a thing for a long time, if we ever needed to push something through the whole network at once, how would we do it? Thursday hadn't known the answer then. She knew it now. She pulled the intake logs and the transport manifests and the stewardship processing records onto a data shard in the 11 seconds, while Sether's attention was divided between her and Tuesday's voice in the corridor, which had risen in a distraction that Tuesday had chosen of her own accord, which was Tuesday's gift. To understand which moment was the one that needed filling, Thursday closed her fingers around the shard and she looked at Monday and she said, "Come on." Monday looked at Sether, and Sether looked at Monday. And there was a moment that lasted about as long as it takes to understand that a choice has already been made, that it was made a long time ago by a grandfather sitting at a kitchen table with 7 daughters who looked exactly like each other, who insisted that they would share everything, who understood that the only thing that could not be taken from a people was the part of them they had already given away to each other. Monday picked up her bag. She stood. She did not look at Sether again. They came out through the East Service exit at the run, Tuesday with her hand pressed against her face, and Monday with her arms wrapped around her middle, and Thursday, 3 steps ahead, already calling Saturday on the hard line. And Saturday was there. She was already there, the transport running and the doors open, because Saturday had not moved from that alley in 4 hours, because Saturday had looked at the clock and decided that whatever the timeline said, she would be there when her sisters came out. They were 3 blocks away before the bureau alarm triggered. They were 6 blocks away before the Quorum patrol frequency shifted to pursuit pattern. They were 8 blocks away when Friday, in the sublevel across the street from a communications relay, pushed the entire contents of the data shard onto every human-accessible frequency in the sector at once. The intake logs, the transport manifests, the stewardship processing records that used the word incineration 4,700 times in 11 months, the census projections that showed that the Quorum's managed reduction had a termination point scheduled in 8 years, at which point human population in the settled worlds would reach a threshold that the Quorum's equilibrium doctrine defined as non-viable. Non-viable. Another word chosen carefully, another word that meant something terrible when you stopped saying it quickly. The broadcast lasted 6 seconds. It hit 38,000 individual communication nodes across the sector grid before the Quorum jamming protocols engaged. It was enough. In 6 seconds, 38,000 people learned the word incineration in a context they could not unknow, and humans, as their grandfather had understood, and as the Quorum had failed to calculate, do not unknow things. They were 11 blocks away when the first protest frequency opened. They were 15 blocks away when it became 3 protest frequencies. They were in a safe house in the sublevels of District 7, with Monday's medical status stabilized, and Tuesday's eye carefully dressed by Sunday, who had spent her rotation days near the medical hub and had the hands for it, when the number of protest frequencies exceeded the Quorum's ability to monitor them individually. Thursday sat on the floor against the wall, with her knees up and her head back and the data shard in her palm, empty now. And she thought about their grandfather at the kitchen table, the patience that looked like anger, the precision of his love, which had never been soft, which had never needed to be. He had not raised them to be hidden. He had raised them to be one face, one name, one presence. And he had done it not because he was afraid of their multiplicity, but because he understood that a world which could only count to one needed to be taught to count higher before it encountered them all at once. He had taught them to wait. He had taught them to memorize. He had taught them to give everything to each other so that nothing could be taken. He had understood, with the bleak exactness of someone who had watched 3 colonial governments decide that inconvenient populations were administrative problems, that the only real census was the one you held in your own chest. The names, the voices, the small human textures, Tuesday's black humor, Wednesday's careful hands, Friday's silences that meant she was already 2 steps ahead, Saturday's absolute refusal to leave anyone in an alley, and he had made 7 daughters memorize each other so completely that they became something a census couldn't count. Not 7 people, not one person, but the specific and irrational and unkillable thing that happens when human beings decide to be responsible for each other. Monday was alive. Her children were alive in her, small and plural and already in violation of every doctrine the Quorum had designed. Thursday closed her fingers around the empty shard. Outside, in the night above Sector 12, she could hear the protest frequencies multiplying. And underneath them, just barely, the sound of 38,000 people learning what they already knew. That they had been counted and found inconvenient, and that they were done being convenient. She let herself close her eyes. She let herself think, for the first time in 9 days, that the door Monday had been looking for might still exist somewhere past. The door Monday had found, that there was a difference between a wrong door and a dead end. That this was not over. It wasn't. But for the first time since Wednesday had come in from the cold with the token in her palm and that particular silence in her eyes, it didn't feel like only ending. It felt like math. New math. A different count. 7 at minimum, more with time.